My name is Mark Skidmore, and today I'm going to be talking about weather modification. I am a professor of economics at Michigan State University, where I study the economics of natural disasters. The work I'm going to talk about today comes from two papers. The first is a paper that was invited to be a part of a journal. It's currently under review, but in that paper, we try to do a survey of all the weather modification activities and documentable geoengineering activities, mostly experimental, all around the world and sort of organize it in. And so the conclusion of that paper is really a call for greater transparency and a registry for all of those activities that are occurring around the world. The second part is a case study of a particular weather modification program in Kansas, where we try to evaluate the direct effects of the cloud seeding program, as well as potential indirect effects such as unexpected flooding or effects on areas outside of the target area. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, so we talked last week, we had a guest come in and talk about just geoengineering and whether the commercial airlines are engaged in this activity or not. And so that brought up a discussion about, well, how much do we really know? What can we know? What don't we know? And I recently wrote an article or a paper on primarily focused on weather modification, not so much on geoengineering. It was an invited paper for a journal, and it's currently under review. But what I wanted to do was evaluate, just try to assess what was happening globally in this space. So I'm going to talk about that paper mostly, and then I want to close with a sample of analysis of a cloud seeding program in Kansas, because I think it kind of gives a good taste for the difficulty and challenge of evaluating the program, including the potential negative effects, like we hear about things that happen where there's this inundation and flooding, or sometimes with different types of weather modification, you might get rain here, but what happens downwind? So there are these potentially unintended impacts, but they're difficult to quantify. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So first, we'll look at what weather modification is, and make a distinction between that and geoengineering, and then talk briefly about the history of weather modification, provide an overview of what's happening globally in this area, who's using it, and what types of weather modification there are, and then a sample of, well, how does it work? Is it effective? And then finally, some research questions that I think we still would like to have answers to, and some needs. Okay, so I think we all know the difference. Geoengineering is an effort to alter the Earth's climate, and potentially some of the actions in geoengineering are difficult to reverse. So there's a real risk, I think, more so than weather modification. Weather modification, on the other hand, is defined as intervening in localized weather events. So there are potential negative impacts, but they tend not to be, they tend to be reversible. You can stop doing it if you want. So there are a number of different types of geoengineering efforts, potential efforts to influence the global climate. Probably the one that we talk about most is solar radiation management through the injection of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. There's also carbon capture and storage. There is marine cloud brightening projects, mixed phase cloud thinning, and then efforts to make the Earth more reflective in order to cool it. So this might be preserving and thickening glacial ice, discussion about the importance of various forests, creating a layer of microbubbles on the ocean surface to shade coral reefs, Even things like installing white roofs, or this is more like a localized kind of thing, but I wrote a paper with one of my former students a few years back looking at heat island effects in urban areas. There's so much concrete in buildings that the average temperature in an urban area is higher because of the heat absorption, and then it stays hot for longer, into the afternoon and evening. But if you have more green space, that dissipates the effect, especially during extreme heat. In urban areas, that creates stressors, and especially for people who are not healthy, and that leads to more fatalities. So that paper was looking at fatalities associated with urban extreme heat, and that green space helps that. Okay, so these are all sort of an overview of different types of geoengineering. Weather modification, again, is more focused on localized weather. And the dominant approach is cloud seeding. And it's used all over the world for rain enhancement, to increase snowpack, to reduce hail damages, fog dispersal, potentially to reduce storm impacts, or reduce lightning, and even used to reduce air pollution. There are other types of approaches that are also being used, or at least experimented on. Ultra, ultra short lasers, methods of altering solar absorption patterns, even satellite systems. There's some discussion, which I'll mention in a little bit more detail later. Electrical charges and sound waves. And these are all efforts to influence localized weather events in one way or another. The first cloud seeding patent was by Vincent Schaefer and Bernard Vonnegut in 1948. By the 1960s, we were doing a lot of experiments, and I have several early experiments listed here. Project Skyfire, which was designed to prevent lightning-caused wildfire. Project Skywater. This was a focus on rain enhancement. And Project Storm Fury, an effort to modify hurricanes. I don't know how well some of these early efforts were, but there was a lot of experimentation going on. And at that time, President Johnson stated that the time has come for us to move vigorously forward to explore the possibilities of modifying and controlling the weather in beneficial ways. So it was, it was very much kind of out in the open back then. And right now, even though the United States has a number of cloud seeding and weather modification projects happening in the various states, it's really a state-run kind of activities. About 7 or 8 states have active programs now. We don't, as far as we know, there's no acknowledged weather modification or climate engineering or anything happening at the federal level officially. If you go into the federal budget, there's no line item for weather modification or geoengineering or anything like that. There are some military documents that I'll refer to in a few minutes that suggest that there is activity, and it's embedded within the military. There are cases of weaponization. The U.S. Department of Defense acknowledges that it had used cloud seeding for military purposes during the Vietnam War. There is a paper by House and colleagues that was written in 96, and then Boger in 2009, about the use of weather modification by the DoD. One is called Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. It was an Air Force research paper. The other is by Operational Defense Through Weather Control in 2023. Again, it was a research report by the Air Command and Staff College at Air University. So we have documents that show us that there is activity happening at the federal government within the United States. but it's embedded in the Department of Defense. NOAA doesn't have any programs that are acknowledged right now. But there are many countries who openly acknowledge and use it. What my co-author and I did, her name is Paijun Liu, one of my former students, we tried to do a scan of every country to determine whether or not that country has used in the past or is currently using any kind of weather modification. And we also looked at, to some degree, some geoengineering activity, although we found little official activity going on other than experimentation. So in China, they use weather modification regularly. Even the Olympics in Beijing was a very notable thing. They used weather modification to avert rain during one of the celebrations, and that was widely acknowledged and written about. Right now, China is trying to develop a massive cloud seeding project on the Tibetan Plateau, which is about the size of Alaska. And there's a report that I'll refer to later on, an article about how India is concerned because if the cloud seeding activity does occur, China wants the rain in the tributaries from the plateau, but India is concerned that they might get flooding on their side of the plateau. So those are the kinds of international issues and challenges that pop up on occasion. And then the Chinese government has announced plans to move rain clouds thousands of miles through an atmospheric corridor using unspecified satellite technology. I don't know if they can actually do that, but the Chinese government has said they plan to do it or can do it. So we reported on it. The Japanese government has several different reports talking about use of weather modification for a variety of purposes. Just recently, they set moonshot goal number 8, which says this: the realization of a society safe from the threat of extreme winds and rains by controlling and modifying the weather by 2050. So they believe that the technology is coming along enough that they can modify storms so that it's not a risk to them. The United Arab Emirates uses electrical charges via drones into clouds to try to enhance rainfall. Hungary has a 10-kilometer grid-based ground system every 10 kilometers through nearly the whole country. Again, it's primarily for hail suppression. Canada has several weather modification programs. One is in Alberta. Again, it's hail suppression, and it's funded by insurance companies, not the government. Mexico, there is a Volkswagen plant in Mexico that uses hail cannons to emit sound wave blasts to disrupt hail formation. There's a new entity called Make Sunsets that was conducting geoengineering experiments in Baja California, and they would use these big balloons and then emit some of this sulfur dioxide, releasing it into the upper atmosphere to reflect heat from the sun. But Make Sunsets was doing this without the consent of the Mexican local government or national authorities. And that really ticked the government officials off. And so in Mexico, geoengineering experiments are banned in the whole country. Australia has weather modification. They use ionization technology, whereby it imparts negative charges on aerosols in the atmosphere to enhance condensation and the growth of water to induce rainfall. Romania, Serbia, and Switzerland have hail missile launch systems, again, a cloud seeding based kind of system. In the United States, there are 8 states that currently have some type of weather modification or cloud seeding program. each state has its own legal and regulatory structure. In Texas, Rainmaker has technologies that disperses charged water droplets into clouds. In Mississippi, there's a Nissan plant, again, that has hail cannons to emit sound wave blasts to disrupt hail formation. I'm going to talk about Kansas, which fully cut its program in 2016, but several other states, California, I think Idaho, North Dakota. I've done some evaluation of the North Dakota. So some places do snowpack, others in California, for example, do snowpack and rain enhancement. North Dakota does hail suppression program. But again, there's no officially acknowledged federal government program that I know of. In in Malaysia, they have a cloud seeding program primarily to reduce air pollution, so if they can induce rainfall to get the pollution out of the air. There are some well-documented geoengineering experiments. Make Sunsets has conducted activities in Mexico, in Baja, which was banned by Mexico once they found out. But there are some experiments happening in Reno and San Francisco. Russia experimented with geoengineering in 2009. The UK recently experimented with it. Ironically, it's called stratospheric aerosol transport and nucleation. Their nickname is Satan. And then there are some marine cloud brightening projects. There were going to be some trials announced in the Seattle, Washington area, but it faced a lot of opposition. There was a lot of pushback, so they weren't able to try the cloud brightening project there so far. So all of these other sort of geoengineering experiments are designed to either deflect certain waves in order to keep the Earth cooler or keep the coolness in and prevent the energy from the sun from coming through or allowing heat to dissipate more quickly. And so all of these have been experimented, documented cases of experimentation, but I have not been able to verify with any kind of, solid resource that geoengineering is happening. I think it probably is happening, and I think the military, in the case of the U.S., the military is involved in doing some of that. The first official government person to, say, hey, we do geoengineering was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when he became HHS secretary. So we noted that in the paper, but he provided no evidence. There was no official document supporting that claim. So we have the case of a government official saying, yes, this happens, and he wanted to stop it, but there is no there, at least as far as I know, there was no documentation or support. And of course, that claim by RFK Jr. was highly contested. So in a paper like the one that I'm writing, I can only include items where there's clear documentation. And so that, so that I can talk about some of this stuff, but I can't go and say, well, I think that, this is happening because of indirect evidence or suggestions. I know that there is a lot of other evidence that suggests that there is something happening. And so that's a challenge, is really kind of getting something really concrete that you can hang on to and say, yes, this is going. And I'm not saying that I know that whether it's happening or not. I think it is. If you have, when we were talking about it last week, I looked at all of the information. I was familiar with some of it, but if you have a lead on official government documents or something that that you can really hang on to, I'd appreciate it if you could send it to me. In the paper, there was a list of all of the countries and whether or not they have used weather modification in the past, and whether or not they're using it now and for what purpose. So you can see here, China, for example, has used it and is currently using it, and they use it for fog dispersal, hail suppression, rain enhancement, snowpack, all of those. So they are very open about the activities. And you can see on India, even though India was complaining about or concerned about China's work in the Tibetan Plateau, they have their own weather modification program. The United States, you can see down here to the far right below, there are a number of states that have it, have used it. Just recently, Florida has banned it in all types of geoengineering and weather modification. They banned it in Florida. And there are 20 some other states that have legislation that they're considering to ban it as well. And I think that's a testament to the lack of transparency in the United States because we think there's stuff happening, and I think there is some evidence, but we don't really know. So, Florida just says, okay, they're supportive banning everything. So, this is the second half of all of these countries. So there are many countries, every continent does it at some level. And I think we were pretty thorough. I think we got nearly all of them. So if I focus just on weather modification, they're a little easier to evaluate than geoengineering. Geoengineering is affecting the whole climate potentially. And I've thought about, well, how can we measure it? What's happening? What are the implications? Does it affect the temperature? We can see some things in the sky, and we think that some of that is geoengineering, but I think it's really difficult to evaluate. And cloud seeding programs or weather modification programs, I think, have greater potential to evaluate because you can see when a locality or a government implements the program. So you have a before and after. In a number of cases, you might adopt the program and then eliminate it. And so you have a period of time before the cloud seeding. You have a period of time during cloud seeding. And in some cases, you have a period of time after cloud seeding. So you have these transitions over time and across space in the use of cloud seeding, and that gives us a handle on whether or not these things are doing what they're supposed to do, or potentially having challenges. So some of the concerns about the weather modification, number one is this question about who owns the water in the clouds. If you use cloud seeding and you induce rain in one area, what happens downwind? Do they get less rain? And how do you measure that? And then, so there are a whole host of national and international laws that I think deserve consideration because the property rights about who owns the potential water, very similar to, a river and drawing water from a river. If you do that too much upstream, the downstream people won't get access to the water. But in a similar way, that can happen with clouds as well. So there's that potential negative effect downwind. And then every once in a while, there can be potential for excess rain or flooding that occurs because of the cloud seeding. And again, this is really hard because you have to have certain conditions in order to say we're going to cloud seed. You have to have humidity and moisture in the air in order for any cloud seeding to be effective. So the choice to cloud seed is dependent on whether there's moisture in the air. If there's moisture in the air, maybe it's going to rain anyway. And so evaluating whether, if there was a flood, evaluating whether the cloud seeding caused it or contributed to it is difficult. And so in April 2024, there was a massive storm in the United Arab Emirates where it's basically a desert. And so there's within a very short period of time, there was more rain that received in just like within a day or two than the UAE would get in a whole year. And so there were massive floods. And so people said, well, it's the cloud seeding program that resulted in this. But government officials say no cloud seeding was happening during that time. On the other hand, I gave a presentation about this at University of Illinois, and one of the graduate students said, well, they haven't done any cloud seeding since. So there was a lot of pushback because people thought that it was at least partially the result of the cloud seeding. It's difficult to know for sure, but people thought that. And as a result, the government backed off on its use for a while. There were some catastrophic flooding in central Texas and South Texas earlier this year. So there was, in the central Texas case, there were massive flooding and damage. And in Texas, they have extensive cloud seeding and other weather modification done by Rainmaker Technology Corp. So Rainmaker said that they did cloud seeding on July 2nd, but not in the affected areas in July 3rd and 4th. So again, people were saying it was caused by cloud seeding, but we don't really know. It might have been a contributor. It's hard to say. But Texas relies a lot on Rainmaker for cloud seeding in various areas throughout the state. And Texas is a very large state. But here's some images of the very sudden flooding that occurred in the Central Texas case. So was cloud seeding, at least in part, a reason for the severe flooding? Very difficult to know. And as I mentioned before, China is developing this project in the Tibetan Plateau, but India is concerned about flooding on their side of the plateau, again, highlighting these international tension and the need for some sort of cooperative arrangement and communication around this kind of activity if it's going to happen. But again, India has its own weather modification program, so it's not necessarily opposed to it, but they are concerned about the potential spillover effects for them. So this brings me to one case study of the Kansas program that I wrote with Paijun Liu. It was just published earlier this year, or this past year. And actually, this is 2025. It was in 2025. The Kansas cloud seeding is for two purposes. The primary is to reduce hail damage, and the other is to enhance rainfall. So we want to evaluate the efficacy of cloud seeding, thinking about, well, does it actually affect hail size and magnitude and also enhance rainfall? Does it result in improvements in crop yields or reduce insurance losses? And then can we measure the intended effects, but also the unintended effects? So there could be impacts downwind, and there can be potential inundation and result in flood damage to crops. And so that's what we wanted to do. And this is a nice case study. Number one, because Kansas is right in the center of this hail-prone region. They are a leading state that produces both wheat and sorghum and among the top 5 states in producing corn. And then Kansas used cloud seeding for several decades, primarily in West Kansas, where it's drier, so they could use rain enhancement, and there's greater potential for hail. So in our data, we are able to go back to 2002, and back then there were 14 counties out of all the counties in Kansas that used this program. And you can see that there are several cases where a county increased and started using it, but for the most part, these counties stopped using them over time. And then finally, by 2016, there were just two counties left using it. And then after 2016, the program that was run by the state just stopped. And so the way the county could have the option of joining the program, and it was subsidized by the state, but you still had to make a contribution to to help pay for it. But it's really not terribly expensive at all. It's a very small part of the overall county budget and a very small part of the overall state budget. So that what's nice about this is that you have changes over time in the decision made in the, not to fund this program and not to do it, or in some cases to do it. And so you have these discrete changes, and so you have panel data, and for all the counties, and we do this in a few ways. But that's a nice thing about this case study because you can see going from having the program to not having the program, and it's staggered, so you're less likely to have any one year have a big influence on this outcome. So we use this sort of regression analysis. We control for wet conditions, dry conditions, good growing degree days or dry days. And then you have a variable just as an indicator of whether that county seeded in that year. And then you have another variable about whether or not the county that was upwind from you had a cloud seeding program. And so I've highlighted the main result that I want you to focus on here. If a county engaged in cloud seeding, the size of the hail was smaller and rainfall was greater. Those are the weather variables. The crop losses weren't affected for hail or drought, at least not significant in these estimates, but the flooding was greater and it was highly significant. So if you cloud seeded, you had more damages from flooding. So this is sort of, I think the first study that sort of looks at this unintended impact and measures it or tries to measure it. But crop productivity is greater. Corn needs water more so than wheat or sorghum. And you can see the productivity was a big increase in productivity for corn. And then we had this interesting result too, that if there was a county upwind from you, your sorghum productivity was less. And so that could, it could be the result, and sorghum needs less rain, for example. So maybe they got more rain than they wanted. It's possible. I don't know, but from these estimates, then you can do a cost benefit analysis. And if you don't take into account the flooding losses and just the increase in productivity, the benefit cost ratio is great. But in the counties that were downwind, there was this negative effect that occurred. So if you take into account both the positive intended effects and the potential unintended effects, the benefit cost ratio, there was a net benefit, but it's much smaller if you take into account those negative impacts, the unintended consequences. So this is the kind of thing that I think we need in order to quantify some of the negative impacts. So then you can you can be informed about your decision to participate in the program, or if people are harmed by it, then you can identify that it was the cloud seeding that led to the harm, and there can be some sort of compensation mechanism if you're going to choose to do it. So from these findings, we see that cloud seeding reduced hail in the target areas, it appeared to increase rain in the target areas. It there's evidence that there's increased flooding insurance losses from floods in the target areas, an unintended effect. It looks like there was a reduction in sorghum productivity. And so there's sometimes conflicts that can occur because corn growers might really like to have it because the corn needs more water than, say, sorghum. And so the net benefits are positive, but much lower once the unintended effects are taken into account. And then, by the way, there is a group in Kansas called Citizens for Natural Weather. So there are a lot of people who say, you know what, we shouldn't be messing with this, and so let's not do it. So I think that we need more kinds of evaluation like this to get at the benefits, as including the unintended potential negative effects. I think there are a whole bunch of issues around national and international laws regarding property rights. And then there are, sort of what's happening on the political side. As I said earlier, there are like 20-some states that are considering legislation just to ban this altogether, including any federal government activity, of which the federal government doesn't acknowledge any of it. And so Florida is the first state to fully ban it, even though officially it doesn't exist. So I think that's important, interesting, that we should be thinking about. And then finally, I think the paper providing a survey of all of the types of programs across the world closes with this. We really need greater transparency. We need a global registry of weather modification and geoengineering activities, and so that we can we have a better idea of what's happening, and we have and it enables countries and states to understand and coordinate if they're going to use this kind of thing at all. And citizens need to know about it because it's their tax dollars paying for it. And if there is geoengineering going on, which many of us think there is, we're paying for it. And so there needs to be a measure of greater transparency. So I think that's all I have. I'll stop right there and we can have a robust discussion about it. Thanks.
Okay.